absolutely love getting questions from our fans and readers. From time to time, our friends will reach out to us as well. In fact, actually, one of our good friends reached out and said, hey, I'm thinking about buying a new Pivot Mach 6. Should I get the coil or the air shock option? And he's not the first person who's asked if coil or air shocks are the way to go. So we figured we'd team up with Pivot. We've spent a lot of time on the Mach 6 and like that bike quite a bit, so we thought it'd be a good comparison and test platform for us to evaluate pros and cons of air and coil shocks and possibly help you decide what is going to be the better option for your riding, and if it's even a viable option to own both shocks and quickly do a swap depending on where you're riding. So let's get into it. So during the testing and filming for this video, we spent quite a bit of time just talking with, suspension tuners, specifically Fox. We talked with Kevin Tissue, who's the head engineer at Pivot Cycles, and we'll reference some of our interview questions in the video with him. But for the most part, we'll kind of talk about the two schools of shocks and the pros and cons. So first off, air shocks are lighter, they are more progressive. They are quicker and easier to tune, not only with the fact that you can pretty much infinitely tune, your spring rate by the air pressure, but also you've got the ability to fine tune the progressivity through volume reducers. Now, when you get into the cons of an air shock, they don't manage heat quite as well. There's also a lot more stiction, right? I mean, that shaft that the seals have to slide up and down is a lot larger. So there's just more stiction, more friction, and that will mean it requires a little more force and more energy to open that shock and get it to start sliding and moving. That will mean a slight reduction in traction as well as an increase in feedback to your feet and hands through the bike. Now, when you move over to a coil shock, you've got basically more weight, a more linear feel throughout the stroke of travel. It's not quite as easy to adjust, right? You do have compression and rebound settings on most higher end shocks, but if you want to adjust beyond that, you need to change spring rate. The pros of a coil shock are that they will manage heat better. They have a much more supple, smooth initial feel, so they kind of erase some of the chatter and stutter bumps. They will improve traction, right? Because they are able to be active and moving at a much lower force of velocity to get the shock to move versus an air shock. So traction, suppleness, compliance, those are going to be benefits of the coil shock, as well as a more linear feel if that's something you want, right? I would say comfort is going to probably be a little bit better for those of you wanting a comfortable ride. If you're someone who likes to pop, pump, jump, an air shock will have some pros because it just offers a little bit more platform, and you can and what I mean by that is you can press against an air shock and it will want to return to its extended length a little bit faster and easier. That increased progression in the shock will also help resist it going through travel quite so much. So whether that's into a corner, like a bermed corner, or going off of the lip of a jump, you're pushing into that air can, which is just building in pressure and then releasing out of the corner or off the lip of a jump. Conversely, if you're a rider who likes to plow stuff, the coil shock is, we're splitting hairs, but I would say that the coil shock is understood to be a little bit better at handling just rough, repeated, chunky hits, whether that's roots or rocks. So we'll kind of get into our timed runs, our experimentation, and the different types of trails we rode, and give you our insights at the end of the ride and let you know what we think performs better where and which shock we would choose if we had to pick one. Dropping in then. Air shock. All right, so really quick and easy shock swap, maybe 10 minutes, 3 5mm Allen bolts, very easy. So now we are swapped over and set 550-pound spring for my 195-pound rider weight. The air has been doing really good. I am a fan of the platform and the push and the lively activeness of air, but it's a bike park, and this is a 27.5 bike with, you know, a little less travel than a DH bike is, so the vibration, the high frequency stuff was fatiguing. So I'm really excited to see how the Coil will perform, pros and cons. So let's gear up and go get some more laps in. On the Coil. So one of the things that we did over the course of filming this video and testing these two shocks was interview Kevin Tissue, who is the head engineer at Pivot, and we asked him specifically about kinematic design. Are there pros and cons to switching a bike that comes with an air to a Coil? What should people be conscious of? And also his personal preference and opinion. So during the course of our conversation, we asked Kevin what most of the Pivot Factory race team and pro level athletes look for and want out of a shock and their tunes. And he said that different athletes have certain priorities. So it's always important to listen to what they're looking to get from their suspension. Some athletes on the more descending side of things may lean towards a Coil because of the reduced friction in the shock. It also provides a more supple feel. On the other hand, if someone is very particular about their setup, they will often lean towards an air shock. There are some riders who are constantly tuning and tweaking their suspension, whether it's, you know, weather, day, track erosion, and those types of riders, he said, are more apt to choose an air shock because they can be constantly changing that shock faster and easier than if it were a Coil. What do I like better? Gosh, I'm gonna just screw this one up and answer it in total bike tester fashion and say it depends on where I'm riding and what I'm riding. And I realize that I'm now spoiled because I have both shocks and it's very quick and easy to make that adjustment. But I very much found there to be pros to each shock, right? Which we all knew there would be. I think if I were to pick and buy a new bike though that just had one shock, for my riding style, I would probably lean towards an air shock, but it would be a very hard decision, and I would base that decision on how much travel the bike has and what my intended application for the bike is. So what is my reasoning for that? Timed runs were very close. I would say that there were instances where it was like almost a negligible difference, right? With our amateur timing software, we really couldn't see much of a difference in certain tracks. In other test trails, there was more of a noticeable difference. And again, the clock isn't the only thing that matters to a lot of riders, right? For racers, sure, that is the most important thing between getting paid or not. For a majority of riders, comfort, fun, just general enjoyment are gonna be a lot more important to them. And I think there's a great case to be made for a Coil shock in that scenario. Also, if you know it was really wet and slippery like it was in Whistler for some of our test days, the traction, the ability to keep that tire on the ground with the Coil shock was definitely noted. I appreciated it, I had fun with it. The bike still jumped, it got off the ground, I could pre-hop stuff, it went off jumps fine. I just noticed that the bike would hug the ground a little better. It wouldn't get deflected when I would hit wet roots at an angle or get onto wet rocks quite so easily. You know, on trails like Angry Pirate, where there's lots of quick turns where there's little banks that you're pressing off of, I would notice a little bit of a difference with the air giving me a little bit more to push against, so I could pump almost and accelerate out of corners a little bit better. The difference in fatigue, I would say, also depended on the type of trail. If it was a trail that had lots of big braking bumps or holes, I would feel more foot and hand fatigue with the air shock for sure. I don't know if that's just the heat buildup and the shock just not doing as well as it got hotter, or if it was that stiction just not letting that shock move as freely as the Coil. If I got into bigger hits, you know, chunkier stuff, even or smoother trails, I wouldn't say there was a big difference, but for sure the Coil was a smoother ride, a little bit more enjoyable in certain scenarios. It did tend to be a little bit slower than the Air was just as a whole across the board, but we're talking, I mean, minimal difference there. I did notice the playfulness, the fun factor, the general stiffness of the bike, right? Like, it didn't obviously change the frame, but the bike just felt a little bit stiffer and like it was just a more railed bike, right? Whether that was slamming it into corners or popping it off and into a hip or something. So I would say playful riders, maybe guys who are pedaling a lot longer, want a little bit more pedal platform, the Air is also gonna do you better. But by and large, I still believe by what my hypothesis was at the beginning of this, both shocks are very good and can be good for the right type of rider in the right type of scenario. So that was it. Hopefully you guys had some fun watching this video, and hopefully we brought you a little bit of insight or advice if you're looking to make a purchasing decision on a bike like this or a shock. We'd like to thank Pivot for loaning us this Mach 6. It was a great test bed and we had a lot of fun and sending these two shocks out. So thank you guys very much. Don't forget to subscribe and we'll see you out on the trails.